Today is part 2, which is going to help you to see real life stories of how you can improve and also deepen your creative use of your imagination. It is a follow-on in terms of the case studies that appear in chapter 9 of The Law and the Promise. So these stories are quite inspirational because you can look at how it is that students of Neville Goddard's utilized the steps and the law of assumption to achieve their manifestations. Some were able to manifest their desires overnight. For some, it took a couple of weeks. But time is not what makes the difference. What makes the difference is how you are able to enter into your imagination with the feeling of your desired outcome being accomplished. And that's what these case studies are going to help you to understand how to apply this particular teaching of how you enter into the image. It's something that Neville speaks about throughout chapter 9 of The Law and the Promise. So this story starts with Neville speaking about his friends. When he was on his way to the West Coast, he stopped in Chicago to spend the day with friends. His host was recovering from a severe illness, and his doctor had advised him to move to a one-story house. Acting upon the doctor's advice, he had purchased a one-story house that suited his needs. He was now confronted with the fact that he had no buyer for his large three-story house. So his problem was that he wanted to sell his three-story house, and he was actually discouraged. So Neville says, in trying to explain the law of constructive imagining to my host and his wife, I told them the story of a very prominent New York woman who had come to see me concerning the rental of her apartment. She maintained a lovely city apartment and a country home. But it was absolutely essential that she rent out her apartment if she and her family were to spend the summer at their country home. In previous years, her apartment had been rented out without difficulty, but that was always early in the spring. At the time that she goes to see Neville, the season for the summer rental was seemingly over. Now, although the apartment had been in the hands of good rental agents, no one seemed to be interested in renting it. Neville says, I told her what to do in her imagination, and she did it, and in less than 24 hours, her apartment was rented. He says, I explained how she, by the constructive use of imagination, had rented her apartment. At his suggestion, before she went to sleep that night in her apartment in the city, she imagined she was lying in her bed in her country home. Now, in her imagination, she viewed the world from the country house rather than the city apartment. She smelled the fresh country air, and she made this so real that she actually drifted off to sleep, feeling that she was in the country. The implication is, with sleeping in the country, she had rented out her apartment. When she does this imaginal scene, it was on a Thursday night. At 9 o'clock the following Saturday morning, she phones Neville from her country home, and she tells him that on Friday, a highly desirable tenant who met all of her requirements not only rented her apartment, but he rented it on one condition, that he could move in that very day. Neville suggests to his friends that they build an imaginal structure as this woman had done, and that was that they would sleep imagining they were physically present in their new home, feeling as though they had sold their old home. The implication is that you have your desire. The focus for them was not to be on selling their three-story home. The focus was for them to be living in their one-story home, knowing that their three-story home was sold. Something that Neville draws our attention to in this particular lecture is he says that there is a wide difference in thinking of, which is just the image of the new home. We are actually confessing that we do not have, or that we lack, what it is that we desire. Whereas thinking from is where we enter into the image because we know that we already have it. We have impregnated into our state of consciousness the thought and the feeling that our desired outcome is already ours. We know that it is complete. So when we enter the image, when we enter into our imaginal scene, we are giving life to imagination because we feel and we know that it is real. It is our faith that fuels our desire. It is our faith that feeds this desire. So their imaginal scene was, while they physically slept in their old house, they mentally viewed the world from their new home. They had a visual of what they would see. They imagined the sounds that they would hear when they would be in their new home. For them, it would be, what would it be like when we live in our new home? What would it sound like to be there in this new space? And they had already, in their imaginal space, occupied their new home. Neville says the concept of the cause of your reality being your imagination disturbed his friend. They thought it was magic or superstition, but they decided they would try it anyway. Neville says, I left that night for California, and the following evening, the conductor on the train in which he had been traveling handed him a telegram. It read, House sold midnight last. 1 week later, they wrote and they said to him that the very night that he left Chicago, they fell asleep physically in the old house, but mentally in the new one, viewing the world from their new home, imagining how things would sound if it was true that they lived in their new home. They were awake at that very night from their sleep to be told the house was sold. The implication for their desired outcome was they were in their new home, knowing that implied their old home was sold. This next story is about shifting the focus of her imagining. Mrs. AF enters physically into which she had persisted in being imaginative. Soon after our marriage, her husband and herself decide that their greatest joint desire would be a year in Europe. The objective may have seemed reasonable to a lot of people, but to them, it was tied to a narrow sphere of limited finances. She said, it seemed not only unreasonable, but completely ridiculous. Europe might as well have been another planet. But I had heard your teaching, so I persisted in falling asleep in England. Why England necessarily? She says, I cannot tell, except I had seen a current motion picture featuring the area around Buckingham Palace and had promptly fallen in love with the scene. All I did in my imagination was to stand quietly outside the great iron gates and feel the cold metal bars grip tightly in my hands as I viewed the palace. For many nights, I felt an intense joy being there and fell asleep in this happy state. Soon after, my husband met a stranger at a party who, within 1 month, was instrumental in securing a teaching fellowship for him in England. Within a month, we were crossing the Atlantic, and our supposedly insurmountable difficulties melted as though they had never existed. We had our year in Europe, one of the happiest years of my life. So she says that she spent many nights just feeling the intense joy of simply being there. In terms of her imaginal scene, the implication for her was she would have this feeling of joy. She stayed true to her imagination and she persisted for a month, and she soon saw those results. So I encourage you, do not give up in terms of your imaginal scene. Now look at the next case study in terms of the old house that was made new. In this case study, one of Neville's students says, my home is old, but it is mine. I wanted the exterior painted and the interior redecorated, yet I had no money to accomplish either objective. You told us to live as though our desire is already a reality, and this I began to do. Imagining my old house with a brand new coat of paint, new furnishings, new decoration, and all the trimmings. And the problem was that he had no money to accomplish either of the objectives. He says to Neville, you told us to live as though our desire is already a reality, and this I began to do. So his assumption was imagining his old house with a brand new coat of paint, new furnishings, new decorations, and all the trimmings. He walked in his imagination through the newly decorated rooms. I looked around the outside, admiring the fresh paint. I handed a contractor a check for payment in full. I entered this imaginal scene faithfully, as often as I could during the day and each night before I fell asleep. Within 2 weeks, I received a registered letter from Lloyd's of London telling me I had inherited $7,000 from a woman I had never met. He had known her brother slightly almost 40 years before, and he had performed a small service 15 years ago for the lady when her brother had died in the US. She had written to him asking for some information, which he was able to provide to her regarding how her brother had passed. And he hadn't heard from her since then. Now, the check for $7,000 was more than enough to cover the cost of his house restoration, plus many, many more things that he had desired. This is it. We see in all of these stories of manifestation, in each one, whether it was the couples or the individuals, they would enter into the scene, along with entering and visualizing the scene, that they brought about a union of imagination and the feeling state. I will encourage you to please, please, please look at when you have the thing that you desire. When you have that desired outcome, what would be that feeling? And it must imply that you have this as a result of that desire. So what is the feeling you would achieve when you have the thing you desire? Be sure not to mess with the how. You don't want to prescribe the how, and be sure to always go to the end. Do not mess in the middle. In my example, with my YouTube channel, I feel and I know that I was messing in the middle because the subscriber numbers is not the end. How I would feel when I achieve the subscriber numbers, because when I feel success, it implies I've achieved success. So you've got to look at what implication will that feeling bring about for you. When you have achieved your desired end, you'll have a feeling that is going to imply that you have your desire. Now that we've covered the case studies, I'm going to encourage you to sit down and firstly, choose something that you desire to have as an outcome for you in your life. When you have that desire and it's clear, look at what would be the outcome that you would have as a result of having that desire. Who would you be? What would you hear people say to you? How would you feel? Now that's quite important. Once you've constructed this imaginal scene, bring that feeling of how it would feel to have accomplished that desire. This becomes your assumption, something I spoke about in part 1. When you have that clear imaginal scene and you have a clear assumption, you must take this into the state akin to sleep. Your practice and persistence is what makes the difference. I'll be wrapping up this particular chapter in a third video because there remains a little bit more to be explored in terms of the teachings, so that you can have a better understanding of how you enter into your imagination successfully and implant your desire into your subconscious mind. Please be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. Leave your comments. Let me know what insights did you get out of this week's teachings. Are you enjoying these videos? And thank you for being part of this channel, and I will see you in the next video.